The party was dissolving by the time Adrian Locke stepped onto the terrace. It was nearly 3 in the morning, that hour when even drunken laughter began to sound tired, but he was just settling into the kind of numbness he liked, soft around the edges, distant enough to mute the thoughts he didn't want to face. Music thumped behind him as bodies danced and stumbled across his penthouse, champagne spilling onto floors he'd stopped caring about years ago. Someone yelled his name. He pretended not to hear. The city's winter wind cut through his shirt as he leaned against the railing. It was a relief. Something bracing. Something honest in a way almost nothing in his life was. He pulled out his phone, scanning the mess of notifications until he found the one that mattered, a text from his father, sent an hour earlier. "We need to talk tomorrow morning. At the house." He almost laughed. Of course. His father always worded things like that, sharp and clipped, like an executive decision carried out by a man who didn't know how to speak to his own son. Adrian slipped the phone back into his pocket, taking another long drink of whiskey. The burn dropped warm into the cold hollow of his chest. "Adrian." Mila's voice, too loud and too close. He didn't turn until she was already beside him, heels dangling from her fingers, mascara smudged from sweat and liquor. "Everyone's looking for you. They can look somewhere else." "Come on," she pouted, swaying against him. "The night's still young. It's almost 4. So." She dragged out the word like she could charm him with it, but her smile faltered when he didn't soften. She knew that look he was done. Not with her specifically. Just with everything. He walked back inside without another word. The music, the lights, the laughter, they all washed over him like static. People reached for him, touched him, begged for his attention, but nothing landed. He stepped into the elevator, closed the doors, and exhaled as if he'd been holding breath for hours. He didn't know why the text bothered him. His father summoned him often enough. But something about the tone, the hour, the timing, something felt off. And Adrian hated the feeling of anything he couldn't control. He went home, showered, tried to sleep, and failed. By dawn he was dressed in the first suit he found, driving on autopilot toward a house he rarely visited anymore. He wasn't aware that it would be the last morning he'd wake up in the world as he knew it. The mansion was quiet when Elise stepped into the hallway. Pale morning light spilled across the carpet, and the air felt heavy with the kind of silence that belonged to old houses, expectant, watchful, a little judgmental. She tightened the sash of her robe, steadying her breath. Today mattered. Henry had said she didn't need to be nervous, but he didn't understand. He'd never had to walk into rooms where everyone assumed the worst of him before he even spoke. She found him in the kitchen, glasses low on his nose as he read the news. He looked up and his face softened. "Good morning." "Morning," she replied, smoothing her hair though it was already neat. Her hands shook anyway. He held out a hand for her. "Come here." "You're tense." "I'm not." She forced a small laugh. "Just thinking." "You're a bad liar," he said, smiling as if that were something affectionate. She sat beside him. The warmth of his hand over hers helped, but only a little. "You really think he'll take it well?" "Adrian is complicated. But he's reasonable." She raised an eyebrow. Even Henry seemed unconvinced by his own words. He tried again. "He'll understand." She didn't contradict him, but her silence was enough. Of course the son wouldn't understand. Of course he would see her the way everyone else did. She'd spent her whole life being underestimated or misjudged. She could already predict the look in his eyes when he realized who she was now. Henry squeezed her hand gently. "No regrets." Regret wasn't the right word. Her life before this had been full of uncertainty and quiet struggle, and Henry had given her something she hadn't known how to want until she had it: stability, safety, belonging. He'd been kind. He'd been good to her. "No," she said. "No regrets." He looked relieved, and she wished she felt as certain as she sounded. She walked to the window, pulling aside the curtain. The driveway was empty, glowing faintly in the cool morning light. But something in the air felt charged, like the quiet before a storm breaks. She tried to imagine the man who was driving toward her. Adrian Locke. The prodigal son. The tabloid playboy. A man who lived loudly enough to drown anything real. A man who would take one look at her and assume he knew her entire story. Henry joined her by the window. "He'll be here any minute." She nodded, though her heart beat faster with every passing second. At 7:58, a black car appeared through the wrought iron gates. Elise's breath hitched. Across the estate, Adrian tightened his grip on the steering wheel, a strange tension settling beneath his ribs as the house came into view. They didn't see each other yet, but both felt the shift. The barely perceptible tilt in the morning that warned something irreversible was about to happen. Their worlds were about to collide, and neither of them was ready. The butler opened the front door before Adrian even knocked, but he brushed past him without waiting for the usual pleasantries. He hated this house, its immaculate marble, its cavernous halls, its smell of money that felt colder than stone. He hated how it reminded him of every birthday his father missed, every apology disguised as an expensive gift, every empty room where a family should have lived. He stepped into the foyer and froze. She was standing at the foot of the staircase, dressed simply in a pale blouse and slacks, her hair pulled back as if she tried too hard to look composed but still seemed effortlessly elegant. She wasn't what he expected. He didn't know what he expected, exactly someone slick, hungry, dripping with gold. But not this. Her eyes widened just slightly when their gazes met. A quick flicker of apprehension. Not guilt. Not triumph. Just fear. It caught him off guard. "You're early," Henry said, appearing from the sitting room, adjusting the cufflinks Adrian had given him years ago. "A long time before any of this." "You said morning," Adrian replied flatly. "It's morning." Henry seemed to sense immediately that something in the room was charged. He stepped between them, not protectively, but cautiously, as if he imagined the ground between them might crack open. "Adrian," he said carefully, "this is Elise." Elise. The name felt wrong. Too soft. Too gentle. Too human for what this situation was. Adrian didn't offer his hand. He just stared at her, letting silence stretch thin and uncomfortable. She swallowed. "It's nice to finally meet you." Her voice was warm, melodic even, but trembling under the surface. He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Is it?" Henry's jaw tightened. "Adrian." "No," Adrian said, lifting a hand. "You don't get to referee this." He took a step toward her. She held her ground, even though her fingers tightened at her sides like she was holding herself steady. "How old are you?" Adrian asked. "Adrian," Henry snapped. "Old enough," Elise answered quietly. The response surprised him. There was no bite in it, no defensiveness, just a subtle steadiness, almost weary. As if she'd already rehearsed for this moment, knowing exactly what assumptions he'd make. He hated that. I hated how calm she looked. Hated the idea that she might pity him. "So," he said, pacing once in a slow circle as he examined her, "how long did you wait before saying yes? A week? A month? How long until you realized what this place was worth?" Her breath hitched, barely noticeable, but enough. Not wounded. Not offended. Something else. Something that looked like disappointment. Henry stepped between them fully now. "That's enough." "No," Adrian shot back. "It's not." Elise finally spoke again. "I didn't marry him for this house." "Of course you didn't," Adrian said coldly. "You don't have to. You married the man who owns it." She looked down for a second, not in shame, but in something like resignation, as if his accusation wasn't new to her. As if she'd heard it from others before. As if she had walked into this life expecting to be doubted, expecting to be looked at like she was a threat. Henry pinched the bridge of his nose. Adrian, sit down. Let me explain. Explain. Adrian repeated. Explain what, exactly? That one day you woke up and decided you needed someone half your age at the breakfast table. Adrian. You should have told me, Adrian said, his voice suddenly quieter, rawer. You should have told me before you married her. The pain in his voice startled all of them, including Adrian himself. Elise took a small step forward. Henry didn't hide it to hurt you. He just. Don't, Adrian snapped, turning sharply toward her. Don't pretend you know anything about this family. Her lips parted, then slowly closed. She wasn't intimidated, just absorbing his words with an unsettling calm. As if analyzing him, understanding him, even though she shouldn't have been able to. That bothered him more than anything. But she didn't hit back. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't defend herself. She just looked at him with something unexpectedly gentle in her eyes, a softness he didn't know how to handle. Henry exhaled, heavy and defeated. I wanted you to meet her properly. I wanted to tell you myself. But the opportunity. I kept waiting for the right moment. There is no right moment, Adrian said flatly. I know, Henry murmured. The silence that followed was thick, stretching from one breath to the next. Finally, Elise spoke again, softly this time. We don't have to do this all at once. I understand this is a shock. A shock, Adrian echoed with a bitter smile. That's one word for it. She flinched slightly, not from the hostility, but from the hurt in his voice he didn't bother hiding. Henry touched Elise's shoulder gently. Maybe you should give us a moment. She hesitated, then nodded. But as she passed Adrian on her way out, she paused just for a heartbeat. I'm not your enemy, she said quietly, without looking directly at him. Even if you decide I have to be. Then she walked away. Adrian watched her go, jaw clenched, pulse pounding. Henry waited until the sound of her footsteps faded down the hallway. Then he said, You didn't have to be cruel. Adrian turned on him. I didn't have to be kept in the dark either. This wasn't about hiding anything from you. No. It was worse. It was about Henry making a decision about the family, about Adrian's life, without considering how much it would tear open inside him. The anger throbbed in Adrian's chest, hot and sharp. But beneath it was something colder. Something he didn't want to examine. After a long silence, Henry put a hand on Adrian's arm, tentative, almost careful. Please. Try to understand. Adrian looked at the hand, then at the man who'd placed it there. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like the adult in the room. He felt like a boy again. A boy being told the world was changing and he had no say in it. I don't understand anything, he said. And he didn't. Not his father. Not this woman. Not the strange, disquieting feeling that had lodged itself under his skin the moment their eyes met. But one thing he did know, nothing in his life was going to be the same again. Adrian left the mansion before Henry could say another word. He didn't slam the door, he wasn't 16 anymore, but the quiet click of it felt sharper than any shout. The cold morning air hit him like a blade, cutting through the heat pulsing beneath his skin. He walked quickly to his car, jaw locked, hands trembling around the keys though he refused to acknowledge it. He drove aimlessly at first. Fast. Too fast. Anything to outrun the echo of Elise's voice in his head. I'm not your enemy. He scoffed out loud, fingers tightening on the steering wheel. He didn't believe her. But he also didn't believe she was the calculating manipulator he'd imagined before he walked through that door. Something about her eyes, steady, sad, frightened, and still trying to understand him, had unsettled him. He didn't like being unsettled. He ended up in the city, parking in front of a coffee shop he never visited but had driven past 1,000 times. He stepped inside, ignoring the looks he got: recognition, curiosity, speculation. He was used to it. He hated it, but he was used to it. He ordered black coffee, barely tasted it, and sat in the corner with his hands wrapped too tightly around the cup. He stared out the window at the people walking by, living ordinary lives he'd never know how to be part of. His phone vibrated. Mila. Then 2 others, friends from last night. Then Henry. He ignored all 3. He couldn't think. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't understand why he felt like someone had rearranged the floorboards of his life while he slept. Why her? Why now? Why is it like this? The questions clawed at him, but none of them had answers. Elise stood in the guest room Henry had gently ushered her into, but she didn't sit or cry or even breathe properly. She simply stood by the window, hands clasped tightly, watching the front drive even though Adrian's car was long gone. Her chest hurt. She didn't know why she'd expected anything different. She'd never been naive. She'd braced herself for tension, for suspicion, even for anger. But she wasn't prepared for how personal his hostility felt. As if she'd stolen something from him without realizing what it was. Henry knocked before entering. "He'll come around," he said. She nodded but didn't answer. "He just needs time." "He hates me," she said quietly. "No," Henry said. "He hates what he thinks you represent. He hates feeling left out of a life that's always been his by default." Elise stared down at her hands. "I didn't mean to make anything harder for him. You didn't do anything wrong." The problem was, she wasn't sure that mattered. She finally turned from the window. "Maybe I shouldn't be here when he comes back next time." "You are my wife," Henry said firmly. "This is your home." Something warm flickered in her chest: gratitude, loyalty, maybe love, but it didn't erase the uneasy tension coiling inside her. She knew the look Adrian had given her. She'd seen it before in different forms, from different people. People who assumed she didn't belong. People who assumed she wanted something from them. People who made her prove her innocence before offering the smallest kindness. She had survived those people. But this was different. Because this time, she cared about the outcome. She didn't want to be Adrian's enemy. She didn't want to be the fracture between a father and his son. But she'd felt the way his anger hit her: sharp, raw, confused, and something about it had shaken her in a way she didn't want to admit. By afternoon, the story had already begun spiraling out of Adrian's control. A reporter at the party had snapped photos of him leaving early. A gossip account had posted something cryptic about the Locke family morning surprise. He saw it online when he stopped at a red light. Surprise, he thought bitterly. Yeah. That's one word for it. He tossed his phone onto the passenger seat. He needed to clear his head. He needed to figure out how he was supposed to face a woman who looked at him with patience he hadn't earned. A woman who made him feel something. Something he couldn't categorize. And that was the problem. He drove again, this time slower, until he found himself back at his father's gates at sunset. He sat there in the car, engine running, staring at the house glowing warm against the encroaching night. He didn't want to go inside. But not going felt worse. Finally, he stepped out. The door opened before he could knock. It was Elise. Not Henry. Not staff. Her. She'd been waiting. Not for him, he told himself. For a resolution. For peace. For something that didn't feel like disaster. Neither spoke. The silence between them was tight, stretched like wire. She looked tired but calm, her hands folded in front of her. "Your father's in the study," she said. Her voice was still gentle. Still steady. Still maddeningly composed. He should have walked past her. He should have said nothing. He should have kept his distance. Instead, he found himself asking, "Why did you marry him?" Her breath caught in her throat. Not from surprise she'd expected the question but from how softly he'd asked it. The anger was gone. The resentment was restrained. What was left was something quieter. Something that almost sounded like hurt. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she said, "Because he was the first person who made me feel safe in a very long time." The words hit Adrian harder than anything she'd said all day. He stepped back, not dramatically, not accusingly, but as if he'd been struck somewhere he didn't know he was vulnerable. He looked at her differently now. Or maybe he looked at himself differently through her words. He didn't answer. He couldn't. He walked past her, heading toward the study, leaving Elise standing alone in the entryway with her heart beating too fast and her fingers trembling at last. And neither of them noticed the subtle shift that had occurred, the first crack in the wall between them, almost invisible but undeniably there. Adrian had barely stepped into the study before he realized something was wrong. Henry wasn't pacing or reading or preparing another speech about understanding and family. He was sitting in his leather chair, shoulders slumped, breathing unevenly as if he'd run a mile instead of walked across the room. "You look terrible," Adrian said, more startled than rude. Henry waved him off. "Just a headache. Stress. I'm fine." But he didn't sound fine. He didn't even look like the man Adrian had confronted that morning. The fatigue carved into his face made him seem older than he'd ever appeared, fragile in a way Adrian wasn't ready to see. "Did you eat?" Adrian asked, and immediately hated how the concern slipped out. Henry gave him a weak smile. "Always the caretaker when you think no one's looking." Adrian didn't dignify that with an answer. Before he could respond, a clap of thunder rattled the windows. The sky, bright just minutes ago, had turned black with sudden, heavy storm clouds rolling over the estate. Rain exploded against the glass in sheets. Henry stood and winced. "We'd better close the upstairs shutters. The wind gets through the cracks." "I'll do it," Adrian said before he could stop himself. "You're not climbing stairs like that." Henry looked surprised but relieved. "Thank you." Adrian headed toward the staircase, half expecting Elise to appear again. He hated how aware he was of that possibility. Hated even more the strange pull that made him wonder where she was. He found her in the hallway, already closing windows as the storm darkened the house. She startled when she saw him, then composed herself quickly. "We should secure the shutters," she said. "Henry shouldn't be going up and down right now." "I know," he replied. They exchanged a look, brief, tense, loaded with the leftover fragments of every word from earlier. Without speaking further, they moved through the hallway together, shutting windows, latching locks, securing shutters one by one. Thunder cracked outside, lighting flickering down the corridor. For several minutes, they worked in near silence. It should have been simple. It wasn't. Every time they passed each other, too close in the narrow halls, something in the air shifted. Something unspoken but impossible to ignore. Elise dropped a latch when thunder roared, just a small clatter, but she flinched. Adrian stepped forward instinctively, catching